In the woods of southern Sweden, there's a kind of house your eyes can slide right over. You can be standing 10 feet away and still miss it because it doesn't announce itself like a building. The roof isn't a roof in the way you expect. It's a layer of living ground, grass, moss, damp soil, lying almost flush with the forest floor. From a distance it reads as a harmless swell in the terrain, like the earth is just slightly uneven between the pines. Then you notice what doesn't belong: a door. A wooden door sunk into the hillside, a small window that looks too low to be comfortable, and a chimney that barely manages to rise above the sod like it's trying not to be seen. The whole structure feels less like something built on land and more like something pressed into it. Swedes had a name for these places: Backstuga. People sometimes translate it as a slope cottage or hillside hut, but the word doesn't quite carry the full idea. A backstuga is a home that uses the hill as part of its body, earth forming one wall, sometimes two, with the rest sealed up by stone or timber and hidden under a roof of bark and sod. They were small, often no larger than a modern living room, and they weren't rare curiosities. For a long stretch of Swedish history, they were a visible, yet strangely easy to ignore, part of the rural landscape. What's easy to miss is the scale. Government counts in the 1800s recorded them in the tens of thousands. The numbers climbed through the 19th century, then collapsed with shocking speed. Within a few decades, an entire category of housing that once filled forests and hillsides simply fell out of official life, and then out of memory. That disappearance is the part that should bother you, because these were not temporary dugouts made for emergencies. People raised children in them, people aged in them, people died in them. A backstuga could hold the story of a family for generations, and yet today, you can live in Sweden and never hear the word spoken once. To understand why they existed at all, you have to look at how they were built, who was allowed to live in them, and what it means when a society solves poverty by pushing it quietly into the ground. Walk up to a backstuga, and the first sensation is that everything has been lowered, like the landscape has been scaled down for smaller people. The doorway is often so short you have to duck, not a polite bend either, an instinctive fold at the waist, as if the building is training your body in humility before you even enter. The windows are small and set low, not for aesthetics but for survival. Less glass to lose heat, less opening for wind to find its way inside. The builders followed a simple rule: let the hill do the expensive work. They would search for a slope that faced south, the side most likely to catch weak winter sun in the northern hemisphere. Then they cut into it, carving out a shallow chamber, half cellar, half room. The packed earth of the hillside became the rear wall, and depending on the shape of the slope, the soil could form part of the side walls too. That meant fewer constructed walls, fewer logs, fewer costs. In places where timber was scarce or pricey, the exposed walls were often stacked from fieldstone gathered off nearby land. In more wooded areas, the front wall might be log-built, simple and direct, with no decoration beyond necessity. But the roof is where the backstuga becomes something almost engineered. First came rough planks spanning the top. Over the planks went birch bark, layered like shingles, not because it looked good, but because birch bark sheds water with stubborn reliability. Then came sod, often 2 layers. The first laid grass side down against the bark, the second laid grass side up so it would continue growing. Within months, the roof didn't just blend into the hill, it became the hill, rooted and alive. That weight mattered. Wet sod is heavy. Heavy enough to compress joints, press down on walls, and help seal tiny gaps where cold air would otherwise whistle through. The roof wasn't simply covering the house, it was tightening it. Inside, space collapsed into one room that had to serve as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and shelter. A hearth of clay or stone sat against a wall with a flue running up through the roof. Floors were often packed earth, sometimes topped with flat stones where feet and embers would land. Furnishings were minimal: a table, a bench, a bed frame, shelves fixed to the wall, and the ceiling, low enough that heat didn't have far to rise before it collected where people lived and breathed. Here's the detail most modern viewers get wrong. A backstuga was not a farmer's cottage. It looks like a rustic, humble version of a homestead, so people assume it belonged to someone working a plot of land. But the people who lived in these hillside homes were usually defined by what they didn't have: no fields, no lease, no recognized farm. In the rural Swedish social order, There were tenant farmers who rented land and repaid the rent with labor or produce. They had contracts, expectations, a place in the machinery of agriculture. The Backstuga residents were different. They were landless. And that wasn't a poetic label. It was legal reality. A Backstuga was often built on someone else's property or on marginal village land. Rocky slopes, bog edges, forest strips too steep to plow. Land that couldn't be used profitably for crops could still hold a human being if someone allowed it. So who ended up there? Widows with no inheritance, older people who had passed the farm to a son and no longer belonged in the main house, disabled workers, retired servants, families who had fallen out of the protective net of kinship, day laborers who were needed during harvest and then forgotten when the work was done. Some residents had crafts, basket weaving, small woodworking, spinning, repairs, skills that could earn a little cash or barter. Others survived through seasonal work and occasional charity. Sometimes they were granted a tiny patch of ground, just enough for potatoes, maybe a few vegetables, perhaps a goat or chickens if the landowner didn't object. It was never enough to become independent. It was enough to remain alive, and the state often hated it. Backstuga could be hard to classify, hard to tax, hard to regulate. If the cottage sat on someone else's land, the landowner carried the property responsibility, while the people inside remained nearly invisible in official systems. That invisibility was not an accident. It was part of why the Backstuga existed, a quiet workaround for a loud, ugly problem, because there was another system used for the poor, one that rotated destitute people from farm to farm, forcing them to stay a night here, a night there, on a schedule. It was humiliating for the poor, annoying for the farmers, and inefficient for everyone. A Backstuga offered something colder but simpler. Put the poverty in one place, out of sight, on useless land, and keep it there until the next crisis, the next winter, the next year when the harvest needed extra hands. If Backstuga were only about being cheap, they would still be interesting. But the strange twist is that by trying to save wood, the builders accidentally created homes with thermal behavior that modern designers chased deliberately. Southern Sweden swings hard across the year. Winter air can bite down into deep negatives, and summer can climb into warm days that feel almost out of place in a northern latitude. The air is unstable. The soil is not. A few feet below the surface, the ground holds a steadier temperature. It changes slowly, lagging behind the seasons like a massive battery. That means Earth can be warmer than winter air and cooler than summer heat. And if your home is pressed into that Earth, you inherit its stability. A Backstuga used the hillside as a thermal shield, soil against the back wall, and sometimes the sides created a buffer that slowed heat loss. The sod roof did the same from above. Layers of soil and living vegetation insulated, while the birch bark beneath channeled water away so the wooden structure didn't rot. Meanwhile, the house faced south, not because the builders were thinking in equations, but because they understood sun like any rural people did. You put the opening where the light comes from. In winter, when the sun sits low, its weak light can still strike the front wall and window directly, nudging the interior warmer during the shortest days. In summer, the geometry flips. The higher sun and the overhang of the hillside naturally shade the front, helping prevent overheating. Inside, the low ceiling mattered too. Warmth from the hearth didn't have to fill a tall volume before it reached human level. Heat collected where bodies were. A small fire could do more in a small, compressed space than in a drafty structure with high ceilings and thin walls. No one living in a Backstuga would have described it as energy efficient. They would have said something more basic. It doesn't kill you overnight. A fire banked with ash could hold until morning. The room stayed above freezing longer than it should. Wind that screamed through the trees outside arrived inside as a faint pressure instead of a knife. It wasn't comfort in the modern sense, but it was survival that worked, especially when survival had to be purchased with almost nothing. And once you recognize the logic, earth sheltering, sod insulation, south-facing exposure, the Backstuga stops looking like a desperate improvisation and starts looking like a harsh, intelligent adaptation to a brutal climate. So why did something so widespread vanish so fast? The answer isn't a single event. It's three pressures that arrived close enough together to crush an old rural system in less than a lifetime. First came land reform. For centuries, many Swedish villages operated on shared field systems, land scattered into strips, rights tangled in tradition, common areas used in ways that were never fully written down. Then reforms reorganized the countryside into consolidated private parcels. Farms were combined into cleaner blocks of property, and people physically moved out from clustered villages onto their individual holdings. That reordering didn't just change farming, it changed who was allowed to exist in the cracks between farms. Backstuga often stood on marginal commons, wood edges, slopes, pieces of land nobody fought over because they weren't worth planting. When those commons were absorbed into private property, the informal permission that kept a Backstuga standing could be revoked overnight. Some residents were tolerated, many were pushed out. Then came industrialization. From the mid to late 19th century onward, factories, sawmills, ironworks, railroads, and workshops multiplied. Paid wages, cash wages, offered an escape route rural poverty hadn't had before. A landless laborer didn't have to beg for seasonal farm work if a mill needed hands year-round. Towns swelled. People moved. The children and grandchildren of Backstuga residents left the hillsides for streets, rented rooms, and new identities. And beyond towns, there was the other exit, emigration. Huge numbers of Swedes left for North America across the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and among those leaving were many from the rural poor, exactly the social layer that had once filled Backstuga. The third pressure was harder to measure, but just as lethal: shame. As Sweden modernized, the Backstuga became an embarrassment, a symbol of a past the country wanted to bury. Not literally this time, socially. People didn't preserve them, they dismantled them, built over them, scavenged the timber, let the roofs slump and collapse until only stones remained like odd wreckage in the moss. Official categories shifted too. What had once been counted and named stopped being recorded the same way. The Backstuga didn't end like a tradition with a ceremony. It simply became something people stopped admitting existed, which is why today when you find one, it feels unreal, like a hidden room in the national memory that someone quietly bricked over. A few Backstuga survived for the same reason any fragile thing survives in a forest. Somebody decided not to destroy it. In some regions, local historical societies preserved small clusters along old footpaths, places where you can still walk from one low doorway to another and feel how these homes were arranged at the edges of proper settlement. They restore the interiors without polishing them into fantasy. Packed earth floors, blackened hearthstones, shelves that suggest how little you could own without starving. The ceiling close enough that you understand, in your body, why warmth mattered more than dignity. Other survivors exist because individuals treated them like puzzles worth solving. A collapsed sod roof doesn't look dramatic until you try to rebuild it. The bark must shed water sideways. The sod must be thick enough to insulate, but alive enough to root. The weight must seal gaps, but not crush the structure. And stone walls, fieldstone walls, are slow architecture. They demand patience, hand placement, and the kind of muscle memory people used to have when building was not a specialized trade, but a rural necessity. In Småland, there are Backstuga tied to local stories that were never meant for tourists. A hillside dwelling might be remembered because a name clung to it. An old nickname, a family tragedy, a record in a parish book that hints at how hard the life was inside that low room. In some cases, restorers find that the Backstuga wasn't just poverty, it was pressure, despair, isolation pressed so tightly into a small space that the walls feel like they've absorbed it. And then there are the Backstuga connected to work. Some were built by laborers attached to nearby ironworks or sawmills, people who came with a spouse, a few children, and no land to claim. They solved housing the only way they could, with stones from the field, logs from the edge of the forest, and a hillside willing to become a wall. You can still see the logic in the construction, the dug slope forming half the enclosure, saving materials that the builder never had in the first place. When you stand in front of one of these preserved homes, what hits you isn't quaintness. It's the realization that tens of thousands of people once lived like this, not as an oddity, but as a normal rung on the ladder of rural society. And that the ladder itself was later kicked away so thoroughly that most people don't even recognize the shape of the rung anymore. Step through the doorway, and you feel the temperature change before you fully register the darkness. Outside, the air might be sharp, the kind that dries your throat. Inside, the cold is different, slower, thicker, less violent. The earth holds on to its steady state, and the room borrows it. The walls are stone and soil. The ceiling sits close. Light, when it enters, arrives as a narrow slice through a small window that seems designed for survival rather than comfort. It's easy to imagine the rhythm of a day here, because the room has no choice but to tell you. The hearth is the center. Food, heat, light, work, everything circles that spot. A bench isn't furniture, it's seating, storage, sometimes a bed. Shelves aren't decoration, they're inventory. The floor isn't rustic, it's what happens when boards are expensive and the ground is free. And once you understand how it worked, a Backstuga stops being strange housing and starts looking like a mathematical answer to poverty. If you can't afford 4 walls, use the hill as one. If you can't afford shingles, use bark. If you can't afford insulation, use sod and soil and the temperature stability that exists under your feet, whether you know the physics or not. The builders didn't need modern terminology. They needed a room that didn't freeze solid, a roof that didn't rot through, a place where a family could make it from one winter to the next. What disappeared wasn't the technique. Earth-sheltered design still works, sod still insulates, south-facing orientation still matters. The real vanishing act was social. The rural class that lived in these hidden homes dissolved into cities, emigrated across oceans, or was pushed into different systems until the Backstuga no longer had an official purpose. Which means that when you find one now, sunken into a slope, roof grown over, stones swallowed by moss, you're not just looking at an old building. You're looking at a solution that only exists when a society decides certain lives should be kept out of view, tucked behind the farm, pressed into the hillside, quiet enough that if you don't step closer, you can walk right past it without ever noticing that someone once lived here, listening to the wind above the sod, waiting for the fire to catch, counting the days until the next time the world needed their hands. Because in a place like this, the future always felt like it was just about to